Well, you can see from the coverage of January 6 in the United States that whether something is misinformation or disinformation is highly subjective. And that's why in America they have the First Amendment to the Constitution, which sets in stone the right to free speech, protecting speech, the press, religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. Without freedom of expression and speech, you cannot call yourself a free country. It's the primary freedom from which all other freedom flows. There are some exceptions, of course, even in America. Obscenity, true threats and defamation, as well as incitement to imminent lawless action, are not covered by the Constitution's First Amendment, and the limits to those aren't perfectly clear either. But the general vibe of the thing is clear. Government cannot restrict your right to speak freely on any major issue, period. In Australia, we have many restrictions on our freedom of expression. Our defamation laws are much tougher, and there's a myriad of laws to protect people in certain circumstances where the courts are involved, especially around things like family law. Some of these laws are okay and some not so much. But there's a new kind of law being proposed now that is very disturbing. The Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, as it's become known, which is now before federal parliament, has been rightly condemned by everyone from the Human Rights Commission to the Law Council of Australia to peak civil liberties groups. And the Liberal Party's Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman said there have now been more than 10,000 sign-ups to the Bin the Bill website. Bin the Bill. Coleman says the government consistently uses the term misinformation to describe opinions that it doesn't like. And now they want to make government officials the arbiter of truth through their misinformation bill. The government wants to set up the Australian Media and Communication Authority, ACMA, as its Ministry of Truth on what we can and can't say online and on shows like this one. So how would we ever be able to criticise ACMA? And how would we ever be able to criticise the government if the government decides what is misinformation or disinformation? As David Coleman points out, under this Orwellian proposed law, nothing the government authorises can be misinformation. But criticism of the government can be misinformation. This is indefensible in a liberal democracy. And we have all seen how quickly those on the left side of politics will call any reasonable statement disinformation or misinformation. Like, pointing out that a document that is actually longer than one page is actually longer than one page. Prime Minister Albanese would do well to learn from his horrific voice disaster not to try to bully ordinary Australians and just ditch this thing before it becomes the massive public issue it is going to become. Do us all a favour, Albo, and just drop it. Stand up to the control freak Karens in the bureaucracy trying to shove this thing down our throats and put them back in their box and simply say no. You've burned up all your political capital in one dog of a policy on The Voice, and you'll be finished if you try another one. Joining me now to discuss this atrocious piece of legislation is the Secretary of the Libertarian Party of Australia, formerly known as the Liberal Democrats, Jordan Dittloff. Jordan, thank you very much for taking the time to join us on the other side. We really appreciate it.
It's good to be on the other side.
This is no doubt a very big issue for the Libertarian Party. You've been looking into it for quite some time. Can you just explain for people who are not aware of what this new law is proposing, exactly what it's saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And in your intro, you described ACMA as being the sort of arbiter or the body that will say what we can and can't say. And in some ways, that would be less insidious than what this bill actually does. What this bill actually does in the finest traditions of left-wing censorship or censorship of any kind through history is it first seeks to have publishers censor themselves. And ACMA is proposing to first set standards for what misinformation and disinformation are in the general sense, and then essentially wait to impose, to see those standards be actioned by publishing bodies and digital social media platforms themselves.
So it's doing the old self-regulation thing first.
Yeah,
you try,
absolutely.
you regulate
the
yourself,
first and
and then
easiest thing they would like to do is for publishers to self-censor. And what's really in their crosshairs with this bill, and it's explicitly flagged in the report that was commissioned under the Morrison government by ACMA. ACMA, unsurprisingly, came back and in its report recommended it be given wide-ranging sweeping powers, of course, as any censorious regulator would.
yeah,
But the real mischief that they identified, or the real threat that the government perceived and ACMA perceived in this report, is platforms like Telegram, like Rumble, providing this parachute. You've no doubt, and many of your listeners and viewers have no doubt, had content creators that they're fond of talking about this concept of having a parachute away from platforms like YouTube, like Facebook. Twitter has become better recently under Elon Musk, but still lots of problems. And these platforms have created spaces where free speech is permitted and encouraged. And that is, of course, the absolute death knell for government organisations and other bodies that are trying to push a particular narrative where dissent or dangerous ideas might be a threat.
But Jordan, they are trying to. I mean, this is quite clearly going to put pressure on shows like this. I mean, I'm not feeling comfortable in Australia at the moment with the state of laws, and I'm quite careful about what I can and what I can't say. But it's going to be even more problematic for all broadcasters, particularly those who share a view that is not held by the government, and this show being sort of, critical of both sides, of both major parties. We're probably never going to get an easy run. But it's a bit scary, right? I mean, ultimately, let's say we don't self-censor appropriately, or we step over the line because we didn't realise. I mean, the vagueness of all of this is very helpful to the government as well. They like to manipulate with control. Governments always want to control by keeping laws vague. That's something that the Chinese government does, the Communist Party's governments do all the time. They make laws incredibly vague so that they can just interpret them as they feel, whenever they feel like it.
Well, it's more than that in a way, because one of the things that this bill doesn't do is it doesn't really define what is truth. It doesn't define what will be considered to be misinformation or disinformation as a matter of fact. That question is left to question mark, and the bill really puts that to two people. It leaves it to publishers themselves to determine what is misinformation and disinformation, with, as you say, these incredibly loaded stakes and almost a gun pointed to the head of publishers saying, you know what the right thing to do is. You know what is misinformation, disinformation. You'll do the right thing. And so what will happen is publishers will interpret misinformation or disinformation as simply anything that is controversial. And the people who are proposing this legislation, we already have self-censoring and guidelines in place for platforms like YouTube and Facebook, where John Ruddick, MLC, our most recent elected member of parliament, his maiden speech was censored by YouTube. So it's not as though we're in this free speech nirvana at the moment. And that's not enough for these people. They want to put that beyond doubt. And the other thing this legislation does is it takes away the right of individuals to protest when these rules and legislation and rules and guidelines are applied. Because if Rumble or Telegram or YouTube takes down this video, you can't complain via administrative law or the other mechanisms you normally would be able to challenge a bill, because essentially the government is not the one who has removed your content. They've had these publishers do the dirty work for them. So unless you have a publisher, and maybe Twitter under Elon Musk would fall into this category, possibly, but unless you have a publisher with the resources and willpower to actually challenge these legislations and these interpretations, it's almost impossible to have your day in court.